before her disappearance, he tells his girlfriend, who doesn't even know that he's not single, he tells her he's a widower and that this is his first Christmas he's going to spend alone. Welcome to 1111 True Crime. Hello, everyone. Oh my goodness. We're going to be doing the LACI and Scott Peterson case today. So some of you are maybe unfamiliar with the case or need a refresher. There are others of you that are very well familiar with every detail of the case. I vaguely remember what happened and so forth. However, I went back and I did a whole bunch of research to kind of bring us up to speed. Copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act 1976, allowances made for fair use. There's no denying this guy, Scott Peterson, is not a good guy, you guys. I'm just going to tell you. His actions are very sus. So this says 2004, this is just the History Channel, Scott Peterson convicted of murder. On November 12th, 2004, Scott Peterson is convicted of murdering his wife, LACI, and their unborn son. A jury of 6 men and 6 women delivered the verdict 23 months after LACI Peterson, who was pregnant, disappeared on Christmas Eve from Modesto, California. The case captivated millions across America and saturated national media coverage for almost 2 years. When initially questioned about his wife's whereabouts, Peterson claimed that LACI had disappeared sometime after leaving the house to walk their dog, and after he left on a fishing trip to nearby San Francisco Bay. About 1 month later, Amber Fry, a 28-year-old massage therapist from Fresno, California, came forward to tell police that she'd had an affair with Scott Peterson, shattering his image as a devoted husband to his pretty and pregnant wife. As police continued to search for LACI and clues that might explain her disappearance, Scott Peterson sold her sports utility vehicle, leading to suspicions that he might be trying to get rid of evidence. The bodies of LACI and her baby were found washed up on shore near the marina where Scott Peterson kept his boat on April 13th and 14th of 2003. Within a week, Scott Peterson was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder with the special circumstance of double homicide, which opened the door for the prosecutors to seek the death penalty. He was arrested in San Diego carrying large amounts of cash, his brother's passport with new hair color and a new haircut, seemingly on the verge of running from the police. Soon after pleading not guilty to the charges, Peterson retained the legal services of well-known celebrity attorney Mark Giros. His trial began on June 1st, 2004. Over the course of 19 weeks, prosecutors introduced 174 witnesses and hundreds of pieces of evidence designated to paint Scott Peterson as a cold and heartless man who continued to lie and cheat on his wife even as he appeared on television feigning despair over her disappearance. They pointed out how he referred to himself as a widower even before his wife's body had been found. The prosecution case was hampered, however, by the fact that they had no eyewitnesses to the crime and had not found a weapon. Meanwhile, heroes worked to convince the jury of an alternate scenario in which someone else had murdered LACI while she was walking the dog, then framed Scott after learning of his alibi from the news. Peterson did not take the stand. Finally, on this day in 2004, after 7 days of deliberation that involved the two replacement jurors, Scott Peterson was convicted of first-degree murder of his wife and second-degree murder of his unborn son. He was unemotional during the reading of the verdict, which was greeted with cheers and celebration by LACI's friends in the audience and the hundreds of supporters waiting outside the courthouse. On March 16, 2005, Scott Peterson was formally sentenced to death by lethal injection. On August 24, 2020, his death sentence was overturned by the California Supreme Court. His conviction was upheld, however. So Scott Peterson's affair, that he doesn't deny, with Amber Fry actually started approximately about a month before his wife goes missing. And what's really, really, truly disturbing that I can't let go of is before LACI is missing or anything, Scott Peterson's wife, LACI, who's approximately 8 months pregnant, before her disappearance, he tells his girlfriend, who doesn't even know that he's not single, he tells her he's a widower and that this is his first Christmas he's going to spend alone. And then LACI disappears on Christmas Eve, and he spent Christmas as a widower, basically. Or so we would be led to believe. He sold her vehicle within 2 weeks of her being missing. Is that true? This happens to be CNN.com. SUV returned to missing woman's family. Now, this is dated. Remember, LACI went missing on Christmas Eve of 2002, like 2 months later. Wednesday, February 5th, 2003, this is posted. Modesto, California, LACI Peterson's family had more criticism Wednesday for her husband, Scott. This time, he sold his missing wife's Land Rover and has reportedly considered selling their home. So your wife goes missing, you sell her vehicle, and you're talking about selling the home. Almost like you know she's not coming back. Peterson, who disappeared Christmas Eve, is due to deliver a baby boy next week. Her husband recently sold her SUV because the police impounded his Ford F-150 in a 14-foot aluminum boat. Now, that doesn't make a lick of damn sense. If the police took your car, then wouldn't you need to drive the other vehicle? In an afternoon press conference, LACI Peterson's family announced that the car dealership that bought the Land Rover from Scott Peterson sold it back to LACI's family for $1. LACI's stepfather, Ron Gransky, said they will keep her vehicle until she comes home. So Joyful Dolphin believes that LACI was thrown in the van. So what van, right? Well, I have much more to the story. You'd think it ends there, but it doesn't. So the LA Innocence Project takes up Scott Peterson's case 2 decades after his murder conviction. The nonprofit is now hoping to obtain evidence they say prosecutors withheld to try to secure Peterson's freedom. Decades after Scott Peterson was convicted of murdering his wife LACI and their unborn son Connor, there's now a new move to try to free him. The Los Angeles Innocence Project is taking on his case and has already turned to the courts to request evidence they say was withheld by prosecutors. Scott Peterson, who is now 51 years of age, has spent the last 20 years behind bars. But the LA Innocence Project, which uses forensic and other scientific evidence to exonerate those wrongfully convicted, is now hoping to obtain evidence that would make more than 2 decades old to try to secure his freedom. More than 22 years ago, on Christmas Eve of 2002, LACI Peterson, 8 months pregnant at the time, was reported missing from her home in Modesto. Her body was discovered 4 months later in the San Francisco Bay. Her husband, Scott Peterson, who was later revealed as having an affair at the time of his wife's disappearance, was eventually convicted of murdering both LACI and their unborn son, Connor. He was originally sentenced to death. It is a conviction that through the years, Scott Peterson's family has passionately continued to contest. Quote, "There is no forensic evidence," said the sister-in-law, Janie Peterson, speaking in 2021, when Peterson was resentenced to life in prison. "There's no timeline to this crime. Scott Peterson is innocent, and we now are trying to reverse that." Peterson's defense attorney, Pat Harris, said Thursday, "We are very excited to have the incredibly talented attorneys from the LA Innocence Project lend their considerable expertise to helping prove Scott's innocence. The LA Innocence Project, a nonprofit dedicated to exonerating those who are wrongfully convicted, submitted a motion to the courts earlier this Wednesday requesting that prosecutors hand over evidence that it says was available during the trial. According to KXTV, that includes evidence from a burglary across the street from the Petersons' home in Modesto that took place 2 days after LACI's disappearance, as well as documents from witness interviews. Let's stop right there. This is where I have a problem with the prosecution. They lied. News broadcasters swarmed that area. There were several that were there. So 2 days later, we have news, professional media outlets that are saying there is no way in hell there was any robbery 2 days later. They would have turned around and filmed it. They were standing in the yard. It's now known that allegedly this robbery took place on the exact morning that LACI disappeared, directly across the street from her house. Oh, so now what comes to my mind is, all right, so Scott's a piece of crap that had an affair and cheated on his pregnant wife, but that doesn't make him a murderer, right? So people that would rob a house on Christmas Eve may be murderers. Let's continue. Scott Peterson's legal team has requested a retrial a couple of years ago, claiming jurors were improperly screened for bias over the death penalty. A judge ultimately ruled that the bias did not exist and denied Peterson a new trial. 31 people allegedly have come forward. Could 31 people get the wrong day? There's no way. So now I'm like, wait a minute. You're telling me that the whole damn neighborhood has seen LACI walking their dog after Scott has long gone fishing? So before we get into the sightings, where are you now? Fallon says theory she witnessed interrupted the break-in across the street. And that is the theory. The theory that the defense and LA Innocence Project has is that she may have wandered across the street and been like, what's going on here? I know these people. You don't have permission to be here. Now, those that know LACI said that would be something she would probably do. And we're about to get into why it's not just a theory because that took place across the street, but because the burglars themselves were in prison and there was a phone call between the burglar and his brother. And they talked about the pregnant woman. Are you kidding me? LACI's sightings were not a priority. By December 31st, 1 week after LACI went missing, at least 12 neighborhood witnesses had reported seeing LACI the morning of December 24th, 2002. During that first week, Modesto police detectives had only followed up with 3 of these witnesses, all by phone call. No follow-up was done in person. None of these witnesses were asked by detectives to show them where they had even seen LACI. The extent of their investigation into the neighborhood sightings was a few phone calls, despite saying the following in press conferences and affidavits. 12/29/2002 MPD press release. Quote, unfortunately, we have no concrete leads from those tips at this point. 12/30/02 MPD police press release. Modesto police investigators have virtually left no stone unturned, and still any leads as to LACI's whereabouts have not been revealed. And 12/31/2002 and January 2nd of 2003, under penalty of perjury to obtain tracking devices and a wiretap, MPD detectives attested, quote, although witnesses were located in the park area who claimed to have seen a pregnant woman walking a dog, no positive identification of LACI had been established since Scott saw her last at their home. Is this tunnel vision? Did they say, well, this is a piece of shit that cheated on his on his wife, who's pregnant, and so of course he did it. Let's just take him in and get it done. Because even if Scott looks guilty, if LACI was actually spotted and witnessed by multiple people later after Scott left, he couldn't have done it. It would literally mean he's innocent. Sightings of LACI in the neighborhood that morning continued to be reported into January of 2003. All of the neighborhood sightings, most of them say she was walking her dog, Mackenzie. But a few had more concerning information. One female hospital employee described 2 men. Now keep in mind, this is a hospital employee. This is somebody that's going to pay attention, that has a heart, that's used to helping people in distress. And this would stay with this person. So one female hospital employee described 2 men yelling at a pregnant woman who was walking a dog. This hospital employee only received a return phone call. That's it. Another tip from a retired reserve officer, another reliable source, a retired reserve officer, right? Described a pregnant woman being shoved back into a van less than half a mile from Scott and LACI's house. He made repeated attempts to contact MPD and was never called back. Yet another concerning tip came from Lieutenant Aponte, who worked in the California prison. He called Modesto police to report a monitored phone conversation that one of the inmates had with his brother who lived in Modesto. The brother told the inmate that LACI had confronted the burglars who were robbing the house directly across the street from where she lived. That house was, in fact, robbed the day LACI went missing. This conversation was recorded by the prison. Not only has the Modesto Police Department never handed over any follow-up on the tip from Lieutenant Aponte, the tape has been lost. Testimony by lead detective Craig Grogan and the questions asked by him by prosecutor Birgit Fladager implied that following up on the sightings was an impossible task. People's Exhibit 267-3. The blue dot is Scott and LACI's home. The red dots are LACI sightings in the neighborhood. In the area within a 1 mile radius of LACI's home, there were 24 sightings. Within a mile, you guys. Within a 3 mile radius, there were additional 7. This is a total of 31 sightings. What possible excuse did MPD have for not investigating each one of these sightings to determine exactly what was seen by each of the witnesses? Their lack of follow-up resulted in lost opportunities to establish credibility. They may not have all been right, but there's certainly not a lot wrong. LACI was alive after Scott left for the day, allegedly. Detective Grogan continued to excuse MPD's failure to follow up by implying the witnesses' times were off in comparison to when Scott left and when the next-door neighbor, Karen Service, found the dog Mackenzie in the street with the leash on. This is not true. Not only were Scott and Karen's times still being analyzed into January, but some of these witnesses didn't even leave a time as to when they saw LACI. And the tips that did have a time were either not a conflict or were close enough frames that they certainly have merit to follow up. One of these ignored tips was a woman who said she saw LACI 1 block from LACI's home between 10 and 10:30 a.m. Perfect timing, but she was never called back. The Modesto police are also completely missed the significance of the mailman's observations on December 24th. His observations further validated Karen's timeline, the neighborhood sightings of LACI, and the tip from Lieutenant Aponte. Scott's defense attorneys also missed a crucial piece of evidence. The result was an erroneous interpretation of the morning timeline that contributed to their decision to not have LACI sighting witnesses testify in court. Sloppy police work is unacceptable, says Sassy. Sarah Fagan says they didn't want to do the actual work, so they pinned it on Scott. Can you imagine if he truly is innocent? So DNA evidence discovered could be connected to Scott Peterson's case. The Innocence Project wants to test cloth from a mattress found in a van. The van was found near the Peterson home around LACI's disappearance. Peterson's defense maintains a nearby burglary is connected to LACI's death. Traces of human blood discovered in a burnt van could bring Scott Peterson's murder conviction into question as the case is re-examined by the Los Angeles Innocence Project. After the LA Innocence Project began looking into his case, new evidence came to light about an orange van spotted near the Petersons' home at the time. The team had requested courts to allow DNA testing of cloth from the mattress found in the van, as well as testing of the fuel containers that they say helped accelerate the arson fire that torched the van. The van in question was found burnt just over a mile from the Petersons' home the morning after LACI Peterson vanished in 2002. Peterson's defense has maintained a burglary that happened across the street from the home around the same time is connected to LACI Peterson's disappearance. Investigators maintain Scott Peterson dumped his wife's body during a fishing trip before it was found on the San Francisco shoreline. But his family says the burglars are the ones who placed her there, knowing the fishing trip was Scott Peterson's only alibi. Everybody knew that Scott's alibi was that he, at the last minute, decided not to go golfing because it was windy. And so, out of the blue, he took his new boat out. And as he left a very, very populated marina, where, again, there's many witnesses, and one witness could see in his boat, because it's a tiny, tiny John Boy boat is what I call it, which means it's an aluminum frame boat that has like 3 places you can sit and you can see directly in the boat. It's open. You could have seen a bag of Cheetos laying in that boat. And the guy at the boat marina said, nope, he didn't have a thing in that boat. When he went out, that boat was empty. The court never proved where Scott murdered LACI. Never proved anything. Nothing happened in the house or in the garage or in their vehicles or at his work. Nothing. There's zero evidence. They didn't prove how she died. So they didn't talk about how. They didn't talk about where. All they said is when he murdered her. And if we're going with their timeline, I have a huge issue when people are still seeing LACI alive after Scott's out fishing. Just saying.